The stealth skill, the hide action, different types of obscured areas or different degrees of cover, surprise at the beginning of combat, these are all common sources of confusion in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. They rely on multiple subsystems of rules that are spread out throughout the player's handbook and even the Dungeon Master's Guide, and sometimes these rules can get a little iffy in places, so I'm going to give a solid overview of everything to do about stealth and hiding and types of concealment and cover in D&D to hopefully get it all put together in a nice, concise tutorial / explanation / critique. And I will be talking about the areas in which these rules can get vague and even make no sense at times, and what you can do to alleviate that. I'm going to do my best to keep this as clear as possible and not plummet into the mucky pit trap that is stealth and surprise in 5e. To illustrate these points, we have 2 adventurers who have just entered a frozen cave. They are Marlbrist, a dwarf fighter, and Elaine, a human rogue. And just before I jump in, please make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. I'm trying out some different styles of video, doing some different approaches, experimenting a bit. So if you get something out of this kind of content, your subscription, your like, your support basically lets me know that I'm doing something right and that I should continue along the same path. To start off, we're going to look at some key terms regarding obscured areas and then cover. These subsystems relate to stealth. They are the conditions that are needed to even attempt to hide to begin with. Obscured areas are referring to visibility. It's talking about the environment, how easy or difficult is it to see or to perceive in this environment. It's kind of vision based, right? So there's 2 types of obscurement. There is lightly obscured and heavily obscured. Lightly obscured comes from things such as dim light, patchy fog, or moderate foliage. The effect is that it imposes disadvantage on wisdom perception checks that rely on sight. If you're using passive perception, this imposes a -5 penalty to the passive. If you have dark vision, you see normally in dim light, so you don't have that disadvantage. Heavily obscured areas are even darker. It's total darkness, pitch black, or it's opaque fog or dense foliage. The effect here is that things that are within a heavily obscured area cannot be seen. Now, if you have dark vision, you treat darkness as though dim light. You don't see in color, it's still murky, and you have the disadvantage on perception or the -5 to your passive perception, but it's not just completely blind to you. You can see to some degree. Again, the dark vision just has to do with light. It has nothing to do if it's thick smoke or pouring rain or dense jungle undergrowth. So that all works good. Okay, no problem there. So let's look at the frozen cave. Much of the cave has dim illumination as indirect sunlight feeds in from a wide cave mouth, though some portions are totally dark, as shown by the dark gray area in the northwest. Here is a saber-toothed tiger. It's in dim illumination, which means a lightly obscured area. It wants to ambush the characters as its prey. Well, it's going to have a hard time because the dwarf has dark vision out to 60 feet, so he sees normally within 60 feet of himself. In other words, it's as if the tiger is just standing right there in broad daylight. To him, there's no problem, and it cannot hide from the dwarf because of that. Now, let's say that instead, the human rogue is scouting a little ways ahead, and the dwarf fighter is back there behind this massive rock formation or this rock wall. The human does not have dark vision, so the environment is shadowy and vague to her. The lightly obscured area works in this case. It has its effect. Not only can the saber-toothed tiger attempt its hide check and potentially ambush her, she also has disadvantage on her perception checks to see due to the light obscurement. So the tiger makes a dexterity stealth check, and the rogue makes a wisdom perception check with disadvantage. Some DMs would use the rogue's passive perception in this case, and that's fine, including that -5 penalty because of the disadvantage on perception. I personally would call for an active perception check, since the character is actively scouting and looking around for danger. Though if the player really wanted to just stick with the passive perception, no problem. If the human rogue's perception result is higher than the tiger's stealth check, she notices it. If not, she's unaware of the tiger. Changing the scenario a little bit here, let's say the dwarf and the rogue are here, a little deeper into the cave. They are still in the dim illumination, while the saber-toothed tiger and a yeti are in the area of total darkness. The human cannot see at all in the darkness, so she automatically fails to see anything there. The dwarf has dark vision, so he treats the darkness within 60 feet of himself as dim illumination. It's shadowy, and he cannot make out colors, but he can see in it somewhat. In this case, the saber-toothed tiger would contest its stealth against the dwarf's perception that has disadvantage, just like what we saw with the human rogue in the area of dim illumination in the previous example. The yeti, however, is more than 60 feet away from the dwarf, so it's outside of the range of his dark vision. It's pitch black to the dwarf. He has no chance to see it. Now remember, the characters still might hear the monsters. It gives them maybe a general idea of where the monsters are, but that's up to the DM. In this scenario, both of these monsters are proficient in stealth, they're ambush hunters, they're probably trying to be quiet, to prowl around, to prey upon the characters. They're on hard ground, it's not crunchy leaves or anything noisy. Maybe there's ambient noises of the cave, like a wind through the cave mouth or dripping water. So I think the DM would be completely justified to rule that hearing these monsters while they're sneaking there is really not reasonable. Let's modify the scenario again. Now the dwarf is carrying a lit torch. It provides a 20-foot radius of bright light and dim light for an additional 20 feet. Now the two characters can both see better. The game does not say whether two overlapping areas of dim light combine to make bright light, so we have to leave that up to the DM. It makes sense to me, so I typically go for it. The saber-toothed tiger has only melee attacks, so even if it did manage to hide, it is going to get noticed automatically when it approaches for its ambush once it enters into that radius of bright light. So having a light source can be a great option. It's not without its drawbacks, as nearly everything in the game has pros and cons. On the downside, the dwarf has to be using a hand to hold the torch. If he drops it so that he can draw a weapon, I don't imagine it would just snuff out, but maybe its radius of light would decrease. There are spells that produce magical illumination, such as the cantrip Light, which are superior to torches and lanterns in many ways. But even they still have the same drawback that any source of illumination does. Sometimes you don't want to be producing light. Sometimes you want to be slinking around in the darkness yourself. Illumination is not the only cause for lightly obscured and heavily obscured areas. Remember those other examples, such as smoke, fog, or undergrowth. Over here at this cave pool, the water is turbid and murky, has all kinds of minuscule particles in it, as many bodies of water do. It doesn't matter that the dwarf has dark vision or that he's holding a lit torch, because it isn't a matter of illumination. This giant octopus could probably hide in the water using that kind of obscurement. It even has a camouflage trait that gives it advantage on stealth checks that it makes while underwater. The characters are going to have a very hard time noticing the octopus until it's too late. Now, let's talk about cover. Cover has to do with physical blocks, barriers, if you will. And it comes in 3 different degrees. There's half cover, 3/4 cover, and full cover. Half cover is when a part of the terrain or an obstacle blocks at least half of your body. Some examples of that would be a low wall, I assume while you're standing up and not like prone or crouched behind it. A large furniture, a narrow tree trunk, or a creature. It could be an ally or an enemy. The effect is that you get +2 to your AC and dexterity saving throws against attacks or spells or whatever effects are trying to pass through the cover, or the cover is like blocking or in the way. 3/4 cover is when an obstacle blocks at least 3/4 of your body. Some examples of this are a portcullis, an arrow slit, or a thick tree trunk. The effect is that you have a +5 bonus to AC and dexterity saving throws, and that's pretty major. Full cover is when an obstacle completely blocks you. You cannot be seen, nor can you be directly targeted. Okay, so this works fine and well too. Let's go with an encounter this time against some orcs. There are a couple of medium-sized rocks, and there is a big boulder or a huge rock formation. If orc number 1 throws a javelin at the dwarf gets 3/4 cover against the attack, because we can imagine that that rock is covering the majority of his body. If orc number 2 throws a javelin at him, he gets only half cover, because while the rock is still shielding the left half of his body, the orc has a clear shot, a good angle of attack against the right side of his body. If you want to get nitty-gritty with it, you can utilize some guidelines from the Dungeon Master's Guide. To determine whether a target has cover against an attack or other effect on a grid, choose a corner of the attacker's space or the point of origin of an area of effect. Then, from that corner, you trace imaginary lines to every corner of one square that the target occupies. If one or two of those lines are blocked by an obstacle, including another creature, the target has half cover. If 3 or 4 of those lines are blocked, but the attacker can still reach the target, such as the target's behind an arrow slit, the target has 3/4 cover. Again, this gets nitty-gritty, and I do not suggest bogging down into tracing these lines every single time. In fact, you can usually visually imagine the vast majority of these cases. But for the current example, let's take a look at it. Someone might gripe that this dwarf is a mere pixel inside the lines of the rock. Remember to imagine things in character. The dwarf is probably using that rock to his advantage the best that he can. Remember, you only trace the lines to one square of the target's space, so if the dwarf throws a hand axe at a yeti here, it gets no cover. As a rule of thumb, the attacker decides from which corner of his space to draw these lines. He's the one setting up the angle of attack, after all. Alright, now orc number 4 in the upper left has full cover from the characters, and they of course have full cover from it. The huge rock just blocks out everything between them. If orc number 3 moves here, he has a clear attack against the dwarf. If the arrangement is like this, and orc 3 throws a javelin at the rogue, she gets half cover from the dwarf. But the dwarf is also imposing half cover if she fires her short bow at the orc from that position. In many ways, cover is easy and it's quicker to implement than obscurement. It adds a great tactical layer to the combat, and the terrain can really make an encounter more dynamic than just fighting in a plain open room. But how does cover factor into stealth and hiding? To start off with, hide is one of the actions you can take in D&D. Rogues who are 2nd level or higher can actually hide as a bonus action, by the way. So, of course, you need to have some way to become hidden to begin with, like with the obscured areas that we already went over. The saber-toothed tiger was in the darkness, and he used its hide to make a stealth check against the character's perception check. But can't cover also be enough to attempt to hide? Marlbrist, like a true dwarven warrior, is taking on 3 orcs in brutal melee combat. Elaine, the tricksy rogue, is slinking around the rock formation. Here, she has full cover, so who could argue that she couldn't try to hide there? No one can even see her. But what about when she comes around the rock? Here, she has half cover from the orcs. Usually, that wouldn't seem like enough. I mean, you can see roughly 50% of someone. That's hardly a great condition for them to hide in. But she was just behind full cover. Couldn't she just pop out, shoot suddenly, and gain advantage for being hidden? Assuming her stealth check won the contest against the orc's perception, that is, it makes a lot of sense to me. I think that's a great rule of thumb to go by. I can imagine it, so I roll with it. Let's say this isn't combat. Elaine is trying to steal this sword without being noticed by these 3 orcs that are on guard. When she comes from behind the rock formation to merely half cover, could she still remain hidden? The orcs have dark vision, so she is not lightly concealed, or she doesn't have that lesser obscurement. What if she closely hugs to the rock? She flattens herself right against the rock surface. That seems more like 3/4 cover, doesn't it? Surely she could still attempt to remain hidden like that, right? I think so. I can imagine that pretty easily. But a different DM might be a major stickler and might say no and shut that down. Well, that's the way it goes. In a game like D&D, there's so many different variables and circumstances happening, the rules simply cannot account for every specific situation possible. So here's what the actual rules for the hide action say. The DM decides when circumstances are appropriate for hiding. When you try to hide, you make a dexterity stealth check. Until you are discovered or stop hiding, that check's total is contested by the wisdom perception check of any creature that actively searches for signs of your presence. You can't hide from a creature that can see you clearly, and you give away your position if you make noise, such as shouting a warning or knocking over a vase. An invisible creature can always try to hide. Signs of its passage might still be noticed, and it does have to stay quiet. In combat, most creatures stay alert for signs of danger all around, so if you come out of hiding and approach a creature, it usually sees you. However, under certain circumstances, the DM might allow you to stay hidden as you approach a creature that is distracted, allowing you to gain advantage on the attack roll before you are seen. So all of that is not too bad. I do wish that the rules would be a little bit more concise, clear, specific about these sorts of things, though, like exactly what amount of cover or concealment do I need to go into hiding against an active creature? Full cover is obviously enough, they can't see you at all. But what about 3/4 cover? Let's say a monster already sees you, you go behind something that covers the majority of you. Is that enough to attempt to hide from them? What if you are already hidden, you are behind full cover or in total obscurement, and then you come out to an area in which you just have the partial cover or the partial obscurement? Can you still remain hidden? Do you have to make another stealth check? As you can see, the game would have benefited from just a couple more lines of clarification, something like this. In order to become hidden, you need heavy obscurement or full cover. Once you are successfully hidden, you can move into light obscurement, 3/4 cover, or half cover, and remain hidden. Now, of course, the DM does need to have the liberty or authority. He needs to be able to make judgment calls and decisions based upon the current circumstances. I would never advocate for depriving the DM from that arbiter role. But there are certain points of the game that need tight and clear rules, especially when we have things like this. The Wood Elf race has a trait called Mask of the Wild. You can attempt to hide even when you are only lightly obscured by foliage, heavy rain, falling snow, mist, and other natural phenomena. And then there's the Skulker feat, which provides a similar benefit. You can try to hide when you are lightly obscured from the creature from which you are hiding. So this means you normally cannot attempt to hide with only the light obscurement, right? I mean, the rules never come out and explicitly say that. The Lightfoot Halfling has a racial trait that says this: naturally stealthy, you can attempt to hide even when you are obscured only by a creature that is at least one size larger than you. Shouldn't that say only when you have half cover from a creature that is at least one size larger than you? Personally, I don't think you could go wrong with that suggestion that I just gave, that you need to have total cover or total obscurement in order to go into hiding, but then once you are hidden, as long as you just maintain some amount of obscured areas or some amount of cover, you can continue to hide. Then of course, if you have that Wood Elf thing or that Halfling thing or that Skulker feat, then you get this extra benefit where you don't need to go completely behind a wall or completely into thick fog. As long as you have the partial degree of the obscurement, you can attempt to become hidden. You're just that stealthy, that adept at camouflaging and blending in with the environment around you. Part of what complicates all of these rules for obscurement and cover and hiding and all that is that they are spread out in different sections across the player's handbook, and there's even that other bit in the Dungeon Master's Guide. But we have not gotten into the very wonkiest part of it yet. Surprise. I'm talking about actual surprise in the game. Now, 3E and 4E handled this perfectly well with what was called a surprise round. If someone's hidden, they get to act first. They get to take a round first, with the unaware creatures not able to act. Then, after that first pass goes around with just the hidden creatures, everyone gets included and things just run normally. And for whatever reason, the designers of 5E did away with that perfectly good rule and gave us this abomination. Surprise. The DM determines who might be surprised. If neither side tries to be stealthy, they automatically notice each other. Otherwise, the DM compares the dexterity stealth checks of anyone hiding with the passive wisdom perception score of each creature on the opposing side. Any character or monster that does not notice a threat is surprised at the start of the encounter. If you're surprised, you can't move or take an action on your first turn in combat, and you can't take a reaction until that turn ends. A member of a group can be surprised even if the other members aren't. At first glance, that doesn't seem too bad. But, lo and behold, once you actually implement this rule, you will soon run into things that are very strange and make no sense. Take a look at this. The characters are heading northward in the cave, and the saber-toothed tiger is sneaking up on them from behind the huge rock formation. It succeeds on the stealth versus perception contest and is hidden. When it's about to leap out and pounce the dwarf, the DM says, "Roll for initiative." And the initiative order ends up like this: 20 for Elaine the rogue, 14 for Marlbris the dwarf, and 12 for the saber-toothed tiger. So the first to take a turn is Elaine, who is surprised, so she can take no action nor can she move. Her turn simply ends. Well, she was walking. Why would she suddenly stall out and stop walking? Also, she's unaware that there is a monster, so why would she even roll for initiative? In character, rolling for initiative translates into you are readying yourself for an imminent threat. You are activating in response to an incoming challenge. Well, that makes no sense to roll initiative if you are aware of no threat. Furthermore, once her turn ends, she is back to being able to take reactions. Imagine if she were a wizard. That means she could cast spells like Shield, Absorb Elements, or Counterspell, even though she's being taken by surprise. Also, why is she surprised? There is no surprise yet. As far as she knows, she's just walking along. Surprise seems like it would occur after the vicious beast pounced on her or her ally from its hiding place. That's when someone would startle and their surprise reflex would kick in. Or is it that we're only supposed to roll initiative and have the surprise rule kick in after the saber-toothed tiger makes its attack from hiding? Like it leaps out here, attacks Marlbris with advantage, in effect gaining a surprise round as it were in prior editions because only it acted. Then comes the initiative and the surprised. The rules do not state that that's the way that things are supposed to be played. And look at the Assassin Rogue's signature class feature, Assassinate. Starting at 3rd level, you are at your deadliest when you get the drop on your enemies. You have advantage on attack rolls against any creature that hasn't taken a turn in combat yet. In addition, any hit you score against a creature that is surprised is automatically a critical hit. So if we did things that way, that would mean the Assassin Rogue, before combat, before initiative in the not a surprise round, would shoot and hit with a critical hit sneak attack, which is pretty devastating. Then initiative would be rolled, and let's say that she goes first or before the enemy. She shoots again against the enemy that is surprised, and once again, critical hit sneak attacks assassinates. That doesn't sound right, but nobody plays it that way. Lead designer Jeremy Crawford has even confirmed the surprise rules as written on social media, saying, "In D&D, you roll initiative when hostilities start, even if there are people involved who aren't yet aware of those hostilities. The unaware creatures follow the rules on surprise." This, of course, led to more and more questions and mixed reactions of all kinds. One such reply commented, "This sort of bothers me about 5e. In previous editions, you could truly surprise players with an ambush, etc. Now the impact is lost by roll initiative." Any thoughts? I agree, I stand by my original criticism. How are you feeling surprised and rolling for initiative if you aren't even aware that something is happening at all? Imagine it's late at night and you're just sitting there watching YouTube in your room, and then just outside the window next to you, a werewolf is hiding. Unless you're Spider-Man and your spider sense starts tingling, you're not going to suddenly pause and feel shocked and surprised the moment before the werewolf bursts through your window. The simple solution that a lot of people employ is the surprise round. It makes a lot of sense. The hidden creatures act first in their own round. They can even roll for initiative if the DM finds it's a more organized way to do things. They get to act, the unaware creatures don't get to act. Then after that surprise round finishes, the other creatures roll their initiatives, you can add those in, and things play out normally. Here's a scenario. The dwarf and the rogue have noticed the saber-toothed tiger sneaking along. The dwarf also noticed the orc in the darkness to the north. The rogue's stealth check beat the tiger's and the orc's perceptions, so only the rogue is hidden. She takes a shot with her shortbow, with advantage, and sneak attacks the tiger. That takes her out of hiding. Then everyone rolls initiative, combat begins normally. It's simple, it accomplishes exactly what we need. We can even consider the tiger and the orc surprised until they've rolled their initiative, for the purposes of features that reference the surprise condition. Here's a somewhat different, more complex scenario. The saber-toothed tiger successfully hid from the dwarf, but the rogue noticed it, and she is hidden from the tiger and the orc. The orc is hidden from everyone, and it has noticed the dwarf and the tiger, though it's unaware of the rogue. So the orc, the tiger, and the rogue have successfully hidden, at least to some degree, so they're the only ones that roll their initiative. They get the following order like this: 18 for the saber-toothed tiger, 16 for the orc, and 13 for Elaine, the rogue. First, the tiger leaps out from hiding, attacking the dwarf with advantage. Then the orc's turn comes, but it actually doesn't want to reveal itself just yet. It wants to see how something plays out here. It readies a javelin attack just in case it wants to do an attack in the meantime. Then Elaine creeps up, shoots an arrow with advantage, sneak attacks the tiger, and she retreats back to behind the cover. The orc chooses not to throw its javelin. It's probably just going to slink back to its warband and alert them of the characters. The dwarf rolls initiative, inserts himself in there, and the next round just includes everyone like normal. So stealth can be complicated, especially until you get the hang of it. Sneaking at first seems like it would be this very simple, natural, intuitive thing, but once you get down to like the nitty-gritty specific maneuvers that are happening turn by turn in this dynamic environment, the complexity ramps up pretty fast. And as I mentioned before, it does not help that all these different components that are related to stealth are spread out through different sections of the books. I think all of these subsystems should have been contained together in one comprehensive stealth section, even if that meant some of those rules, like maybe the cover and the obscurement, would get repeated again later on in another section about like the environment or dungeon terrain. You know, it's better for things to be a bit redundant, for them to be confusing and disorganized. So I hope this walkthrough was helpful for you. I would encourage you to take a little bit of time to think about these things and communicate this with your group. Establish in advance how you want to treat some of these areas of stealth that are more open-ended, or especially these areas that can kind of break down into nonsense if you let them. It's never going to be perfect. There's eventually going to be some kind of exception or some kind of one-off situation. But as long as you establish this kind of core baseline of how you're generally going to treat things, and you apply it the same way to both the characters and to the monsters, that's going to help a lot. It's going to go a long way to prevent your game from breaking down and stalling out when you're right in the middle of this tense stealth scene, or if you're right in the middle of this like shocking ambush. You don't want that emotion to be lost. So I do hope that was helpful for you in some sort of way. So thank you as always for watching, and may your adventures be many.